Some of you will already have met Dr. Stephen Bray. Earlier this year, through Colleen, who organised the 3C Information Days, he was one of the speakers. After that one was held in the Winton area, attendees asked to hear more. With that in mind, Colleen has ensured that they can by having Stephen here today with us. Stephen presents his findings to the forum about the work he's doing in the field of carbon budgets for the grazing industries of the rangelands. When I asked Stephen to tell me something that might help you connect to him as a person, as I said to you, the importance of connecting to the speakers, not only as people with information, but also as people themselves, then the thing that he told me was that he lives on 40 acres with his family of ironbark country at the caves just north of Rockhampton. And he spent the last 2 weeks being grumped at by his wife for buying a motorbike for his 2 sons without her permission. So he's feeling himself quite comfortable to be out here today and to be well protected. But ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Dr. Stephen Bray.
Thank you, Jerry, and I'd like to thank Colleen for inviting us to speak today. My topic today is looking at the emissions comparison between a grazed and destocked property, and specifically looking at fire. The talk today will look at Australia's and Queensland's greenhouse position. We'll talk about some of the work and understanding that's been undertaken in Queensland to look at how the greenhouse impact has on grazing businesses, and I'll work through an example of grazing versus a destocked property. Australia emits about 600 megatons of carbon dioxide per year, and Queensland emits the most emissions of any state. This is followed by New South Wales and Victoria. If we look at what the emissions are within Queensland, along the bottom here we have stationary energy, which is power stations. We have transport, so that includes all fuel use. We have fugitive emissions, which is the methane that leaks out of gas out of coal seams, which is why they're doing a lot of coal seam methane before they actually dig up the coal. There's industrial processes, agriculture, we have waste, which is looking at rubbish tips, and we have land use change and forestry, which is mainly about tree clearing. We actually have a look at how our greenhouse budget is actually changing over time. The first bar here is 1990 and the second bar is 2007. So for stationary energy, which is power stations, the emissions have actually almost doubled during that period. In transport, they've also gone up. Fugitive emissions has gone up. Industrial processes is about the same. Agriculture has gone up a little bit. Waste is about the same. But land use change, which is tree clearing, has come down quite significantly, and that's due to the land clearing legislation. And as new data for the latest land clearing figures comes in, that bar should continue to decline. When we're talking about agricultural industries, a lot of people just assume that we add this part, the agriculture, and the land use change or clearing, plus a bit of transport and contribution from the power stations. So it's really, agriculture really has a large part of the economy. And if you look at it from a sectorial point of view, agriculture actually emits the most of any sector in the economy, so 29%. And mining is about 14%, and manufacturing is about 28%. So that's why there's a fair bit of pressure on the agricultural industries to actually do something. If we look at what makes the agriculture emissions, and Ed presented this earlier, methane, which is this big blue area, makes up the majority of the agricultural emissions. The other part that's also of interest to grazing properties is prescribed burning up here, and that's basically the emissions from having fires or burning off. And the other large one is agricultural soils, and this is mostly from cropping country where they apply nitrogen fertiliser. So when you apply nitrogen fertiliser, there's a emission of nitrous oxides, and so that makes up a significant contribution as well. So I was asked a specific question to address today, and that was to look at what the greenhouse impact is of comparing a grazing property versus destocking. And today we'll go through a process of explaining the calculations, which means it will be quite technical. Also discuss some of the trade-offs and the assumptions you have to make to actually develop up this kind of analysis. And I'll pay particular attention to methane emissions versus burning emissions. As a little bit of background, we'll talk about 1 tonne of carbon. So if you have 2 tonnes of grass, 50% of that's carbon, so that's about 1 tonne of carbon in 2 tonnes of grass. But you need to multiply that by 3.67 to turn it into carbon dioxide equivalents. And the reason all emissions are turned into carbon dioxide equivalents is so that you actually compare the relative value of different strategies. So for nitrous oxides, they multiply, you can actually compare that to something that slows up the carbon dioxide emissions. And I'll also be using local data rather than as much as I can, rather than using data which may be generated. For example, soil emissions were derived in dairy farms in Victoria, which doesn't have much application to out in grazing land around Longreach. Also be looking at it from a property scale, so I'll be looking at the inputs and removals from the atmosphere at that property scale. So we're looking at the total inputs that might be sequestered on a property, and also looking at the total emissions from that property. So that means that not everything is necessarily Kyoto compliant. For example, under Australia's volunteered to assess their carbon budget under Kyoto compliance, they don't actually look at soil carbon. So my analysis is based on experience from past work and drawing on past work which is applicable to this region. And in the past I've done a lot of work with looking at woodland monitoring, the woodland thickening issue, and building on Bill Burrows' work with our traps monitoring sites. We've also assessed the soil carbon to look at what the proportion of soil carbon comes from trees and grass, and looked at what the relative value and how those landscapes may have thickened up over time. We've also cut down quite a few trees and looked at what the carbon content of trees. So we actually have a good understanding from measuring the diameter of a tree how much carbon is actually in that tree. There's not a lot of information on soil carbon. There's a couple of current projects which are hopefully going to increase our knowledge greatly. And one of those is up in the Northern Gulf and Upper Burdekin area. And there's also, through federal funding, going to look at soil carbon across a range of land conditions and vegetation types across Queensland. The bit of data on soil carbon that has been generated is out of the Charles Towers region as part of the EcoGraze project. And there's also been some assessment of soil carbon differences between the exclosures where it's fenced off to prevent cattle access or livestock access versus the grazed area. There's also been a lot of fire research done in the Northern Territory, which is applicable to our savanna lands here. And Ed spoke about the livestock methane work that he's conducted in Rockhampton, so we're drawing on that work. And this has been pulled together in a couple of previous reports and looking at what tree management would be as part of a grazing property. And this work looked in the Brigalow belt, so if you allowed some areas of Brigalow regrowth to come back, what the impact on the greenhouse budget may be for those properties, and also looking at woodland thickening up in the Charles Towers region. We've also recently completed a report through RIRDC funding, which Edge Group at Rockhampton were involved in, and looking at the agroforestry and bioeconomic potential in central Queensland. So we looked at retaining strips of vegetation and how much vegetation would require to offset your greenhouse emissions in that system, and what the economic trade-off would be between having more trees and less cattle in those systems. And we've also been doing quite a lot of work looking at the net carbon position of the Queensland beef industry, so at the whole industry scale, looking at what the changes in vegetation may be, as well as what the methane emissions may be and energy use.